Hey there. Welcome tonight. We're diving into the story of David, a young man on the run, desperately trying to escape King Saul who's out to get him. It's a tale of jealousy, faith, and tough decisions. As David hides in caves, we get a glimpse of his struggles, but also his incredible trust in God's timing. Stay with me as we explore the highs and lows of David's journey through the wilderness and the lessons we can learn from his choices. So, picture this David, a young shepherd, has already become the hero of Israel after slaying the giant Goliath. He's brave, he's talented, and most importantly, he's loved by the people. But all of this success, all of this favor from God, begins to stir up something very dangerous in King Saul's heart: jealousy. Saul, the first king of Israel, should have been proud of David, should have seen him as an ally in the battle for Israel's future. But instead, Saul feels threatened. He can't stand the idea of anyone, especially someone so young, getting more attention than him. It's a feeling that starts to eat him alive, and it's something that's only going to get worse as we go on. Now, let's talk about Saul's state of mind. At this point, Saul is mentally tormented. It's almost like his mind is slowly unraveling, bit by bit. He's not only paranoid, but also deeply insecure about his position as king. It's clear that the pressure is getting to him, and instead of turning to God for guidance, he turns inward. His fears and insecurities grow, and they begin to cloud his judgment. Instead of recognizing that his success as king was given to him by God, he starts to think that he has to protect it at all costs, even if that means going after someone who's done nothing wrong. Saul's mental state is deteriorating, and it's affecting every decision he makes. You can see how much Saul's disobedience to God has contributed to his downward spiral. In 1 Samuel 13, Saul is instructed to wait for the prophet Samuel before making a sacrifice to God. But Saul gets impatient, and he decides to do it himself. This act of disobedience begins the unraveling of Saul's reign. God had chosen Saul to be king, but Saul's inability to follow God's commands leads to God's rejection of him. It's like a turning point for Saul. His disobedience begins to weigh on him. God warns him through Samuel that his kingdom will not last because of his lack of obedience. And you know, it's not just a little mistake here and there. Saul's disobedience is compounded by his pride and his refusal to accept responsibility. His disobedience is not just a matter of making one mistake, it's an ongoing refusal to humble himself and acknowledge that he's not the one who's in control. He doesn't repent. Instead, he hides behind his pride and tries to manipulate situations to maintain his power. His actions come from a place of fear, not faith, and that fear spirals into more destructive behavior. At this point, David is caught in the middle of all this chaos. He's still a young man, only in his early 20s, and yet here he is, being hunted by the king. The very man who should be mentoring him, the very man who should be helping him rise up to greatness, is the one trying to kill him. Saul's paranoia has reached a point where he believes David poses such a threat to his reign that he must take matters into his own hands and eliminate him no matter the cost. David, though, is a man of faith. Even though he's been anointed by God to be the next king of Israel, he's not rushing into that role. He's waiting for God's timing. He's not trying to force his way into power. Instead, he's learning, he's growing, and he's preparing himself to become the man that God has called him to be. But as he does this, he has to live in constant danger. He's running from Saul, hiding in caves, moving from place to place in the wilderness. This is not the life he envisioned for himself. Not at all. He's on the run, and it seems like there's no end in sight. In a way, David's life in the wilderness is a time of testing. It's a time when God is shaping his character. C.S. Lewis, a famous author, once said that God whispers to us in our pleasure, but speaks to us in our pain. And that's exactly what David is going through, and God is speaking to David in the wilderness, teaching him things that he could never learn in the palace or on the battlefield. David's time in the wilderness is when he starts to really learn about God's faithfulness, and it's during this time that we get some of the most beautiful psalms that David wrote. Psalms like Psalm 63, which we'll come back to later, are born out of David's deep longing for God during this time of hardship. But let's not sugarcoat things. This is a hard season for David. He's not just sitting around in a cave waiting for things to get better. Every day, he's living in fear, constantly moving to avoid Saul's army. David's men, a ragtag group of 600 soldiers, are loyal to him, but they're also tired. They're hungry, and they're on the run, just like their leader. David is leading them through harsh conditions, and it's a time of emotional, physical, and spiritual strain. The wilderness is a place of testing, yes, but it's also a place of growth. David is learning things here that he will need later in life when he finally becomes king. So, we have to ask ourselves, why is David in this situation? Why is he running for his life? Well, it's because of Saul's jealousy and insecurity. Saul can't stand the idea that David might one day replace him, so he does everything in his power to eliminate him. But in doing so, Saul is actually fulfilling the very thing he's trying to prevent. God has already chosen David to be the next king of Israel, and no matter what Saul does, that's not going to change. Saul's attempt to stop David is like trying to stop a river with your hands. It's futile, and it only causes more damage. This whole situation highlights a few important things for us. First, it shows us the destructive power of jealousy. Saul's jealousy is what sets this whole story in motion. It's what leads him to act irrationally and make decisions that harm not only David, but also himself. Jealousy is a dangerous emotion. It eats away at you from the inside, and it makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. We see this in Saul's life. He's so consumed with jealousy that he can't see reason anymore. Secondly, Saul's situation shows us what happens when we refuse to listen to God's commands. Saul was disobedient, and that led to him being rejected by God as king. It wasn't just one mistake, it was a pattern of disobedience, and it had consequences. When we live our lives in defiance of God's will, it doesn't just affect us in the moment, it has long-term consequences. Saul's kingdom is falling apart because of his refusal to follow God's lead. And then we have David. David, in contrast, is doing his best to live out his faith in the midst of hardship. He's not perfect, he has his flaws, just like everyone else. But his heart is in the right place. He's trusting God, he's waiting on God's timing, and he's learning to be patient. David is a man who, in the midst of great personal suffering, still believes that God has a purpose for his life. He's not taking matters into his own hands. He's not forcing his way into power. He's waiting for God to make him king when the time is right. And that's where we see the difference between David and Saul. David's story in the wilderness is a reminder that even when things seem unfair or difficult, God is still working. David had every reason to be angry at Saul, but instead of fighting back, he chooses to trust God's plan. And this is a message that we need to hear today. There are times in our lives when things don't go the way we want. There are times when we feel like we're being unfairly treated or when we're in a season of waiting, just like David was. But the key is to trust God in the process. Trust that God knows what he's doing, even when we don't understand it. David's time in the wilderness isn't just a physical journey, it's a spiritual one too. It's a journey that teaches him how to rely on God completely. And it's a journey that prepares him for the greater things that God has for him in the future. So as we look at David's story, let's remember that even when life feels like a wilderness, God is still at work. And just like he was with David, he's with us, guiding us, teaching us, and preparing us for the future. David's time in En-Gedi is one of those moments in his life where everything seems to align. He finds both physical and spiritual refuge in a place that stands out starkly against the harsh environment around him. Picture it, you've got the blistering heat of the wilderness surrounding you, the dry, unforgiving desert stretching as far as the eye can see, and yet, right in the middle of all that, there's this oasis, a tiny slice of green and life amidst the barren land. This was En-Gedi, a place that became a sanctuary for David during his years of running from Saul. Now, the Dead Sea, which is just a stone's throw from En-Gedi, is known for its extreme conditions. It's the saltiest body of water on Earth, nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean, and it's the lowest point on Earth, sitting over 1,400 feet below sea level. The air is dry, the terrain harsh, and the sun beats down relentlessly. It's not the kind of place where you'd expect to find refuge, but En-Gedi, with its freshwater springs, offered David exactly that, a much-needed escape from the oppressive heat and his constant sense of danger. In the middle of this desert, En-Gedi is almost like a hidden treasure. The spring, which is also called the Spring of the Wild Goats, brings life to an otherwise inhospitable area. The landscape is dotted with palm trees and lush vegetation, a sharp contrast to the barren land surrounding it. And for David, it wasn't just about finding a cool, shaded spot to rest. It was a spiritual oasis, a place where he could truly connect with God in a way that was hard to do in the midst of constant danger. En-Gedi offered him more than just a physical respite from the wilderness. It provided a place where David could refresh his soul. It's here in En-Gedi that David wrote one of the most poignant psalms in the book of Psalms, Psalm 63. In the midst of running, hiding, and feeling utterly abandoned by everyone around him, David turns to God. He's in the wilderness, and yet, in that wilderness, he finds the presence of God in a profound way. Psalm 63 starts with these words: "O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land, where there is no water." David's words speak to the deep longing he felt in his heart for God, a longing that only intensified because of the harshness of his circumstances. The wilderness wasn't just a physical challenge for David, it was a spiritual test. And yet, it's in the middle of that hardship that he realizes how much he needs God. His soul thirsts for God, just like his body thirsts for water in a land where no water is found. In this desolate, dry place, David comes to understand his utter dependence on God, not just for survival, but for his very soul. David continues in Psalm 63:2, "So I have looked for you in the sanctuary, to see your power and your glory." For David, in the wilderness wasn't just about surviving, it was about seeking out God's presence, even in the most unlikely of places. And as he reflects on God's greatness, he finds that his soul is satisfied in a way that no earthly comfort could ever provide. He says, "Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you." Even in his darkest moments, David is able to acknowledge that God's love and presence are better than anything else in life, better than comfort, better than power, and certainly better than the position he's lost as a man on the run. What stands out about Psalm 63 is how David's focus is entirely on God. Despite the difficulties he faces, his circumstances don't define him. His faith does. Even though he's in the wilderness, facing the constant threat of Saul's pursuit, he isn't consumed by fear. Instead, he is consumed by a longing for God. That's something we can all learn from how often do we allow our circumstances to define us. To determine our joy or peace, David shows us that. No matter what's happening around us, we have the ability to find peace and joy in God's presence. And David wasn't just praying these words, he was living them. In the midst of all this chaos, he genuinely experienced the reality of God's presence. Psalm 63 is a snapshot of David's heart during this time, a heart that thirsted for God, even in the wilderness. But the significance of En-Gedi doesn't stop at its role as a physical refuge or the inspiration for David's heartfelt psalm. This place, nestled on the western shore of the Dead Sea, was a strategic location for David during his time of hiding from Saul. En-Gedi was one of the few places in the wilderness where fresh water could be found, which made it a vital location for any group of men on the run. David and his 600 men would have depended heavily on this oasis for survival. The springs at En-Gedi were a lifeline, offering both the physical refreshment they needed to stay alive and the emotional and spiritual nourishment they sought as they struggled through their difficult circumstances. En-Gedi also had a significant role in the narrative of David's time in the wilderness because it was a place of hiddenness, a place where David could lay low. He wasn't completely isolated there. People knew of his presence in the area, but it was an environment that provided some measure of protection. The rugged terrain around En-Gedi, with its cliffs and caves, made it an ideal hiding place. In fact, it's in one of these caves at En-Gedi that we see a pivotal moment in David's life when he spares Saul's life. Saul, who is chasing David, unknowingly enters the very cave where David is hiding, and David's men urge him to kill Saul. But David refrains. He respects Saul as the Lord's anointed king and refuses to take matters into his own hands. This moment, where David could have taken revenge on Saul, is one of the most telling in his life. It shows the deep trust he had in God's timing and plan. Even in the midst of his own suffering, he believed that it was God's prerogative to remove Saul from the throne, not his own. It was a decision born not out of weakness, but out of profound faith and self-restraint. David knew that his future as king wasn't dependent on eliminating Saul, but on waiting for God's perfect timing. David's time at En-Gedi is a beautiful reminder that in the midst of the harshest environments, God is present. The wilderness isn't just a place of testing, it's a place where God reveals himself. It's where we learn to trust him, to seek him, and to understand that he is all we need. David's cry in Psalm 63, "My soul thirsts for you," is a reflection of a heart that has come to realize that God alone is the source of true satisfaction. This is a lesson that David would carry with him throughout his life. Even as he moved from the wilderness to the throne, even as he experienced victory after victory, his soul's deep longing for God would remain. In our own lives, we may not be running from a king, but we all go through wilderness seasons. We all experience times when life feels dry, when the circumstances around us seem harsh and unforgiving. And in those times, we can either choose to be consumed by our circumstances, or we can choose to seek God in the midst of them. David chose to seek God, and because of that, he was able to find strength, peace, and purpose even in the most difficult of times. His time in En-Gedi reminds us that God is present in the wilderness, and that it is in those moments that we can experience his love, his strength, and his faithfulness in ways we might never fully understand until we are in the wilderness ourselves. In many ways, En-Gedi was a place where David's faith was deepened. It wasn't just a physical refuge, it was a spiritual haven. It's where he wrote some of his most profound psalms. And though it was a place of hiding, it was also a place where David learned to trust, to wait, and to rely on God's provision. It was an oasis in the desert, a reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, God is always with us, ready to refresh our souls and provide us with the strength we need to face whatever comes our way. The moment had arrived, and it was nothing short of a divine twist of fate. David and his men, hiding in the vast expanse of the wilderness, were struggling to stay hidden, running from Saul, who had yet again set his eyes on David as his greatest threat. Saul, who had once been the chosen king of Israel, now found himself completely tormented by the jealousy and fear that consumed him. David, on the other hand, was just a young man, yet a man after God's own heart, caught in the middle of this overwhelming storm. The world around him was constantly shifting, and Saul's pursuit of him was relentless. Little did Saul know that today, he would walk right into the very hands of the man he had been hunting. But in the midst of this great opportunity for revenge, David's heart would face a test, one that would define the type of king he would ultimately become. The cave where all of this happened was located in the region of En-Gedi, a place of refuge and relief in the middle of the desert, a much-needed shelter for David and his men. The rugged cliffs and narrow caves made it the perfect place to hide and regroup, providing protection from the relentless pursuit of Saul. It was a natural fortress, difficult to navigate and easy to defend. Saul, in his usual paranoia, had assembled a group of 3,000 of his finest soldiers, a force that would intimidate anyone. His goal was clear: to track down David and kill him before he became an even greater threat to his throne. It was in this very cave that the unexpected happened. Saul, unknowingly, wandered into the same cave where David and his men were hiding. How it seems like sheer chance, a providential moment orchestrated by God himself. Saul had entered the cave to relieve himself. It's a rather undignified situation for the king to find himself in, but there he was, entering the cave without realizing that the very man he sought to kill was lurking just a few feet away. Imagine the scene. Saul walks into the dark cave, unaware that David and his men are right there, hidden in the recesses of the cave's shadows. The king, having no idea that he's walking into the lion's den, is fully exposed. It's almost as if fate itself had lined up this precise moment. David's enemies, the mighty soldiers of Saul, are all waiting just outside the cave. and the very man who wants him dead is now alone in the cave with him. Now, David and his men, 600 strong, though ragtag and weary, are watching in stunned silence. The opportunity to end all their troubles is here. Saul is completely vulnerable, alone, without his army, and caught in a moment of complete defenselessness. David's men, who have been suffering alongside him, are no less than eager to seize the moment. They're tired of running. They're tired of hiding. And they're tired of seeing their leader be chased by a man who, quite frankly, should have been his ally. They see Saul standing there, completely unaware of their presence. And their instinct is simple now is the time to strike. They've been given a gift, a perfect chance to kill Saul and end the conflict. It seems like God has handed this moment to them on a silver platter. One of David's men, ever eager for the chance to end their suffering, breaks the silence. He whispers, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hand.'" The implication is clear. God has delivered Saul into David's hands. The king is alone, with no one around to stop him, no army to protect him. The moment has come for David to take what's rightfully his, the throne of Israel. The men around David are insistent. They urge him to act, to kill Saul right then and there, to finally take what they believe God has promised him. There's no need to wait, they say. It's all happening right in front of him. Saul is right there for the taking. It's an easy win, but David's heart is not like theirs. While his men are eager for revenge, David pauses. He doesn't rush into action. David doesn't act impulsively. His faith in God's plan is deep, and his respect for God's timing is unwavering. David knows that this moment, though it seems perfect for him to seize, is not the moment that God has chosen for him to become king. David understands that even in his current suffering, he must remain patient and trust in the Lord's timing. He recognizes that this is a test of his character, his faith, and his obedience. And this is where David shows the world what kind of king he will be. Instead of drawing his sword and ending Saul's life right then and there, David decides to act with restraint. He sneaks up behind Saul, who is distracted by his own need, and takes a knife. With incredible care and stealth, David cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. He doesn't kill him. He doesn't take this opportunity for revenge. Instead, he makes a symbolic act, cutting off a piece of the robe that Saul wears, a sign of authority, a symbol of the king's position. But even this action troubles David's heart. He is immediately convicted. The Bible tells us that after David cut off the corner of Saul's robe, his heart troubled him. He felt guilty for even taking such an action, even though it was far less than what his men wanted him to do. David had acted in a moment of opportunity, but his conscience couldn't bear it. He knew that even this small act of disrespect towards Saul was something he could not justify. David's immediate reaction shows the depth of his integrity. He turns to his men, who are waiting expectantly for him to act, and he says, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." David's words here are key. He recognizes that despite Saul's many faults, his disobedience to God and his pursuit to kill David, Saul is still the king. Saul is still the one whom God had chosen to lead Israel. David respects God's decision, and he understands that it is not his place to overthrow Saul. It is God's prerogative to remove Saul from the throne, not David's. David is choosing not to take matters into his own hands, even though his men are eager to see justice done. He shows incredible restraint and self-discipline in this moment. David's men are not pleased with his decision. They don't understand why he would let Saul go, why he wouldn't take the opportunity to end this madness once and for all. But David stands firm in his decision. He tells his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master." the Lord's anointed." With that, he commands his men to stay back and not act against Saul. They are left confused, but David's decision is final. David's respect for Saul is not based on Saul's actions or character, but on the position that Saul holds. David teaches us a profound lesson here. We must show respect for the authority that God has placed over us, even when we don't agree with those in power. Saul was a deeply flawed man. He was paranoid, insecure, and disobedient to God. But David understood that Saul was still the king, and as such, he had to be treated with respect. David trusted that in time, God would fulfill his plan. David's restraint here shows us what it means to trust in God's timing, even when everything seems to be pointing us toward acting on our own desires. As Saul finishes his business in the cave, completely unaware of what has just happened, he leaves the cave and goes on his way. He walks out, oblivious to the danger he was in, and David waits until Saul is far enough away. Only then does David step out from the shadows and call after Saul. "My lord the king." Saul turns around, and David, despite everything that has transpired, bows down before him, showing respect for the king. David has just spared Saul's life, and now he wants Saul to understand why he did it. David's words are measured and respectful. He says to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Indeed, David seeks your harm'? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eyes spared you." David holds up the corner of Saul's robe as evidence, showing that he could have killed Saul but chose not to. "I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed," David says. He further emphasizes that Saul has nothing to fear from him, calling attention to the fact that he is no threat. David even refers to Saul as "my father," a term of respect, even though Saul had tried to kill him. In this moment, David is not just sparing Saul's life, he is showing the world what it looks like to act with integrity, to trust God, and to show respect to those in authority, even when that authority is not perfect. David's actions in this moment are a powerful testament to his character. It's easy to seek revenge when we're wronged. It's natural to want to retaliate, especially when we have the power to do so. But David teaches us a different way. He teaches us to resist the urge to take matters into our own hands, to wait for God's timing, and to show respect even when the person in authority doesn't deserve it. It's a lesson that resonates deeply, especially in times when we may feel unjustly treated or when we find ourselves in difficult situations. And the amazing part is that Saul, in his confusion and frustration, seems to have a moment of clarity. He weeps. Saul's heart is torn between anger and guilt, and he recognizes in that moment that David is more righteous than he is. Saul acknowledges that David has shown him mercy, even though David had every right to take revenge. "You are more righteous than I," Saul says. He admits that David has done good for him, whereas Saul had only ever sought David's harm. The encounter ends with Saul asking David to swear that he won't harm his descendants. And David, in his grace, agrees. The tension between Saul and David might not be over, but for the moment, there's a sense of peace. Saul returns home, and David and his men move on. This moment in the cave is a turning point in David's life. It's a moment that shows his maturity, his respect for God's plan, and his unwillingness to act out of anger or fear. David's restraint in the face of everything Saul had done to him is a model of faith in action. It's a reminder that even in the midst of injustice, God's timing is perfect, and he will make things right in his own way. David trusted God's plan more than his own desire for revenge. And in doing so, he demonstrated the heart of a king. David was a man of extraordinary resolve, but in the depths of his heart, he must have wrestled with the very real temptation to act. After all, Saul had wronged him. He was no stranger to the relentless pursuit of Saul's wrath. For years, David had been on the run, hiding in caves, dodging Saul's army, trying to stay one step ahead of the king who sought his life. And now, here he was, standing in a cave, with Saul himself walking right into his grasp. Saul, oblivious to David's presence, was utterly exposed. This was the moment David's men, loyal to him and frustrated by the long years of hiding, urged him to act. "This is the day," they whispered. "This is the moment God has given you to take Saul's life and claim the throne." They were desperate, not only for their own survival, but for the fulfillment of David's destiny. After all, God had promised David the throne. Hadn't he surely this was the moment when God would give David the victory over his enemy? But David was not like his men. The king stood before him, a mere few feet away, vulnerable and unaware. And yet, David hesitated. His men were insistent. "Go on, strike him down, take what's rightfully yours." But David, the man after God's own heart, stood still. His heart, no doubt conflicted, knew that something deeper than human instinct was at play. There was something more than revenge, more than justice, that he had to consider. David wasn't just in this for himself. This moment wasn't about vengeance, nor was it about seizing an opportunity to claim the throne by force. David understood that. Ultimately, this was about God's will, not his own. At that moment, when David's men urged him to kill Saul, the choice before him was clear. He could take action, end his suffering, and accelerate the arrival of the throne he had been promised. Or he could wait on God, trust in his perfect timing, and respect the position that Saul held. Even if Saul was unfit for the role, David had been anointed as king, but he understood that his ascent to the throne was not a matter of seizing power by his own hand. It was a matter of God's timing, of waiting for the moment when God would remove Saul, not when David decided it was time. So, in that cave, David made the decision to show restraint. David's decision wasn't just an act of mercy toward Saul, it was an act of faith. It was a decision to honor God's plan, to trust in God's sovereignty, and to recognize that while Saul was a deeply flawed and disobedient king, his position as king was still ordained by God. David had been anointed to take Saul's place, but he knew that it wasn't his job to force that transition. David understood that God alone had the authority to remove Saul from power, and until that moment came, David would not lift a finger against the king. It was not because Saul deserved mercy, it was because David respected the office Saul held, and more importantly, David respected the authority of God. David's decision also highlights something significant about his character. He was not motivated by pride or personal ambition. If David had been focused on his own desires, he might have taken the opportunity to eliminate Saul and take the throne for himself. But David wasn't consumed by the desire for power. He didn't see the throne as something to be seized through force or cunning. To David, the throne was something that God would give him in his time. According to God's will, in this moment, David could have acted on his own, but he chose to submit to God's plan, to wait patiently for the moment that God would orchestrate, even if that meant enduring more hardship. What stands out in this moment is how David's respect for the position of the king, despite Saul's many flaws, shapes his decision. David wasn't looking at Saul the man, he was looking at Saul the king, the one appointed by God to lead Israel. David's decision to spare Saul's life wasn't a matter of condoning Saul's actions, but it was a matter of respecting the office that Saul held. Saul had been chosen by God, even though he was no longer worthy of the position, and David, despite everything that Saul had done to him, recognized that it was not his place to remove him. David didn't disrespect Saul, he disrespected Saul's actions, but he still honored Saul's position. In this, David showed an extraordinary maturity that would shape his reign as king. David's decision also speaks to the larger moral lesson of respecting authority, even when we disagree with those in power. It's easy to look at authority figures and, when they fail or act unjustly, feel justified in disregarding their authority. But David's decision teaches us that, as difficult as it may be, we are called to respect the positions of authority that God has established. This doesn't mean we agree with every decision made by those in power, but it means that we honor the role and the responsibility that comes with it. David didn't honor Saul because Saul was a good man. He honored Saul because Saul was the king. And in doing so, David demonstrated a principle that his timeless respect for authority is not based on the worthiness of the person holding that authority, but on the recognition that God is the one who establishes authority. And David's respect for the office of the king, despite Saul's personal failings, speaks to a level of humility that is hard to come by. How many of us would have acted differently if we had the chance to exact revenge on someone who had wronged us so deeply? It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we have the right to take matters into our own hands, to right the wrongs done to us. But David, and in his restraint, shows us that true leadership is about humility, patience, and trust in God's sovereignty. He didn't act out of self-interest. He didn't let his emotions or his pain drive him to make a rash decision. Instead, David trusted that God was in control, and he chose to submit to God's timing. There's also something powerful about the fact that David's respect for Saul's position as king was not based on Saul's personal behavior. In many ways, Saul had proven himself unworthy of the throne. He had made mistakes, disobeyed God, and even sought to kill David. But David didn't base his decision on Saul's actions. He based it on the belief that God had placed Saul on the throne, and until God decided it was time for Saul to be removed, David would not act against him. This shows us that sometimes respecting authority means setting aside our personal opinions, our frustrations, and even our sense of justice in order to honor God's sovereignty. It's not easy, but it's what David did, and it's what we are called to do as well. David's inner conflict, his struggle between the urge to take action and his commitment to God's plan, highlights the tension we all feel when it comes to authority. In our own lives, we may face situations where we disagree with those in power, where we feel unjustly treated, or where we want to take matters into our own hands. But David's example shows us that we don't have to act out of anger, fear, or frustration. We can choose to trust God's plan, to wait for his timing, and to respect the positions of authority that he has established, even when those in power are flawed. David's decision also serves as a reminder that God's timing is perfect. Saul's reign was coming to an end, but God was the one who would bring that about, not David. David's job was not to force the issue or to take the throne by force. His job was to wait on God's timing and to trust that when the time was right, God would make him king. This lesson is crucial for all of us. So often when we try to rush God's plan, to make things happen on our own timetable, but David teaches us that there is wisdom in waiting, in trusting that God's timing is far better than our own. David's respect for Saul's position as king also teaches us the value of honoring authority in our own lives. Whether it's in our workplaces, our families, or our communities, we are often called to respect authority figures who may not always make the right decisions. But like David, we are called to honor their positions, to trust that God is ultimately in control, and to rely on his timing, knowing that he will accomplish his will in his own way. In the end, David's decision to spare Saul's life in that cave wasn't just about mercy, it was about trust. It was about trusting God's sovereignty, trusting his timing, and trusting that God would fulfill his promises in his own way. And that trust was what made David the man after God's own heart. It wasn't his ability to lead armies or slay giants that made David great. It was his ability to wait on God, to respect authority, and to act with integrity, even when it was difficult. And David's example challenges us to do the same in our own lives, to respect authority, to trust God's plan, and to wait for his perfect timing, knowing that he is always in control. Waiting on God's timing is something that sounds so simple in theory, but it can be one of the hardest things to do in practice, especially when everything inside us tells us to act, to take matters into our own hands, and to make things happen on our own terms. David's restraint in the cave, when he had the perfect opportunity to end his struggles by killing Saul, shows us the power and importance of waiting on God. Instead of seizing what seemed like a God-given moment, David chose to wait for God to remove Saul in his own time, trusting that God's plan was far better than his own. David's ability to exercise patience and restraint, even when everything around him urged him to act, serves as a powerful example of the importance of trusting in God's perfect timing. It's so easy to get caught up in the idea that we need to control our circumstances, to force things to happen when we think they should. But David's example reminds us that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is wait. Trusting God's timing means acknowledging that he knows what's best for us, even when we can't see the whole picture. David, by refusing to kill Saul and instead trusting God, was not just being merciful to Saul, he was also demonstrating his trust in God's sovereignty and wisdom. This idea of trusting in God's timing isn't just present in David's life. It's a theme that we see throughout the Bible, particularly in the story of Abraham and Sarah. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but as the years passed and Sarah remained barren, the promise seemed to grow more and more distant. As the couple grew older, they began to question whether God's promise would ever come to pass. In their impatience, they made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Rather than waiting on God's timing, Sarah suggested that Abraham take her servant, Hagar, and have a child with her. This was not what God had promised, but in their frustration and impatience, they took matters into their own hands. Abraham, despite knowing better, agreed to Sarah's suggestion, and Hagar bore him a son, Ishmael. But this was not the child of promise. This was not the son that God had intended for Abraham and Sarah to have. As a result, the consequences of their impatience were felt not just in their lives, but throughout history. The conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, the two sons, would set the stage for a long and bitter rivalry between their descendants, the Arab nations, and the nation of Israel. This story of Abraham and Sarah is a perfect illustration of how rushing God's plan can lead to unintended and painful consequences. Their decision to act outside of God's timing didn't just delay the promise, it created tension and division that has lasted for generations. But in the moment, they couldn't see the far-reaching impact of their decision. They only saw their own impatience and the growing sense of urgency. They didn't understand that God's plan, though delayed in their eyes, was unfolding exactly as He had intended. What we learn from both David and Abraham is that God's timing is perfect, even when it seems like nothing is happening. Waiting on God requires trust. It requires us to believe that He knows the best moment for things to unfold. When we take matters into our own hands, we risk creating our own problems and obstacles, just like Abraham and Sarah did. But when we trust in God's timing, we open ourselves up to the fullness of His plan, which is always better than anything we could have imagined. Waiting on God doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean doing nothing while we wait. David's restraint in the cave wasn't passive. It was an active decision to trust God, to believe that God would remove Saul from the throne in His own time, not David's. David wasn't sitting idly by, waiting for God to do everything for him. He was still living out his faith by trusting, by being patient, and by resisting the urge to act out of his own emotions. This is the kind of waiting that God calls us to. It's the kind of waiting that requires active faith, patience, and trust. It's not about sitting around doing nothing, but about continuing to trust and move forward, even when we don't have all the answers. In our own lives, it's so tempting to rush things. We live in a world that values instant gratification. We have fast food, fast internet, instant messaging, and we can get almost anything with the click of a button. So, when it comes to our personal dreams, our desires, or our spiritual growth, we expect results right away, but God doesn't operate on our timetable. His timing is perfect, and that means sometimes we have to wait longer than we would like. And during that waiting, we learn to trust. We learn to rely on Him in ways we might never have if everything happened in the snap of a finger. David understood this concept, and so did Abraham. Abraham had to wait for 25 years before God's promise of a son was finally fulfilled in Isaac. And during that time, Abraham made mistakes. He tried to rush God's plan, but ultimately, when Isaac was born, it was clear that this child, the child born from God's timing, was the one who would carry the promise forward. The story of Abraham and Sarah teaches us that when we try to rush God's plan, we miss out on the blessings He wants to give us. But when we wait on God, we are rewarded with His perfect timing, which is always worth the wait. Waiting on God is also an act of humility. It's acknowledging that we don't have control over everything. It's realizing that there are aspects of life that are beyond our understanding. It's understanding that while we can make plans and take action, God is ultimately the one who orchestrates the events of our lives. We see this in both David and Abraham. David could have taken control of the situation in the cave, but he chose to trust in God's sovereignty. Abraham could have forced the promise to come true sooner, but in doing so, he created unnecessary conflict. Both men learned the hard way that rushing things doesn't work. But when we wait on God, we experience His peace and His faithfulness. In the story of David, we see that God's timing is always perfect. David waited, and in doing so, he was able to step into the throne when the time was right, not because he seized it through force, but because God had prepared the moment. David's patience, his restraint, and his trust in God's timing were the qualities that made him a king after God's own heart. He wasn't perfect, but his ability to wait and trust God's plan set him apart. So, what does this mean for us? It means that when we face moments of uncertainty, when we are tempted to rush ahead and take control, we should pause and remember God's perfect timing. Like David, we may have dreams and desires that God has placed in our hearts, but we must trust that He knows the best time for those things to come to pass. It means not rushing ahead in our own strength, but waiting patiently and actively trusting that God will fulfill His promises in His way and in His time. In a world that often urges us to hurry up, to push forward, and to take what's ours, David's example challenges us to slow down, to trust, and to wait. Waiting on God is not passive. It's an active choice to trust in His perfect timing. And when we do, we can rest assured that the outcomes will be far better than anything we could have achieved by rushing ahead. In the midst of a tense and escalating situation, Abigail, the wife of Nabal, enters the scene and changes everything. David, who had already been insulted and disrespected by Nabal, was on the brink of making a decision that would have led to bloodshed. His men, who had long been loyal to him, were urging him to act. They saw this moment as a chance to end the conflict once and for all. After all, Saul had been hunting David for years, and here was another man, Nabal, adding to the frustration. David had every right in his men's eyes to take this opportunity and make Nabal pay for his arrogance. But Abigail, in a moment of both wisdom and courage, stepped forward to prevent David from making a rash decision. Abigail was known for her beauty, but it was her wisdom and understanding that truly set her apart. While Nabal, her husband, was described as harsh and foolish, his name even meaning fool in Hebrew, Abigail was a woman of good judgment. She knew that the situation could easily spiral out of control if not handled properly. When she heard that David and his men were on their way, she didn't waste time. Rather than remaining passive, she took swift action. She prepared a generous gift, bringing with her food and supplies, and set out to meet David before he arrived at Nabal's household. Her plan wasn't to confront David with accusations, but to appeal to his better nature. She knew that David was a man of integrity, and that if given the right perspective, he would make the right choice. Abigail's approach wasn't one of anger or confrontation, it was one of respect and humility. As soon as she saw David and his men, she didn't come in with accusations or demands. Instead, she dismounted from her donkey, fell to her knees, and bowed before David. She spoke to him with the utmost respect, calling him my lord and addressing him with a humility that was both rare and powerful. Abigail wasn't simply trying to save her household from destruction, she was stepping into a role that God had set her in. She knew that the future of Israel and David's future as its king was at stake. And it was with this understanding that she spoke to him. Her words were not accusatory, nor were they manipulative. Abigail knew that David was not just any man, he was the anointed king of Israel, even though he had not yet taken the throne. Instead of focusing on the immediate situation and David's anger, she appealed to his higher calling. She gently reminded him that the kingdom of Israel would one day be his, and that, as king, he would need to be a man of mercy, restraint, and wisdom. She acknowledged David's strength and character, calling attention to the fact that God had anointed him for greatness, and that he would be the one to bring peace to Israel. In doing so, she appealed to his future as a leader, not just as a man with a grievance to settle. Abigail's wisdom in this moment wasn't just in her words, it was in her approach. She understood that David's future as king was not something that could be compromised by a moment of anger or revenge. She didn't try to manipulate him by pointing out Saul's failings or focusing on David's right to exact vengeance. Instead, she spoke to David's heart, reminding him that, as the future king, he was called to something greater. She spoke of his destiny and of the enduring legacy that he would leave behind, but only if he chose the right path now. In the midst of this fiery situation, Abigail's ability to de-escalate was nothing short of remarkable. She didn't try to justify Nabal's actions or make excuses for his foolishness. She knew that Nabal's actions were wrong, and she didn't try to cover them up, but she also understood that the bigger picture was not about David's immediate anger or the injustice he had suffered. It was about the future of Israel and David's role in it. She appealed to David's sense of purpose, showing him that the way forward wasn't through bloodshed, but through mercy. She knew that the act of kindness she was offering wasn't just about saving her household. It was about helping David stay true to the man he was meant to be. In a world where leadership is often about power and influence, Abigail's intervention shows us a different kind of leadership, one that is rooted in wisdom, humility, and respect. She didn't seek to command David, she sought to guide him, to help him see beyond his immediate emotions and frustrations. She didn't want David to act in the heat of the moment and make a decision he would later regret. Instead, she wanted him to rise to the level of his calling, to be the man God had destined him to be. By reminding David of his future as the king of Israel, Abigail appealed to something deeper than David's immediate desires. She reminded him that he was called to lead with integrity and compassion, not through vengeance. Abigail's words, calm and full of wisdom, had a profound effect on David. In a moment when he was ready to act on his emotions, Abigail helped him see the bigger picture. Her intervention was not just about avoiding a conflict with Nabal, it was about guiding David back to the path of righteousness and purpose. When David heard her words, he was moved. He acknowledged that her advice had spared him from making a terrible mistake, and he recognized the truth in what she said. David's decision to spare Nabal's life wasn't just an act of mercy toward Nabal, it was an act of self-restraint that reflected his deeper commitment to God's will. David's response to Abigail's intervention speaks volumes about his character. He could have dismissed her words, focusing instead on his own anger and sense of justice. But David chose to listen, and in doing so, he demonstrated the kind of humility that would later define his reign as king. He recognized that Abigail's wisdom was a gift, and he was willing to accept it. David praised God for sending Abigail to him and acknowledged that her intervention had kept him from shedding unnecessary blood. David knew that by sparing Nabal, he was not just saving a life, he was staying true to the man God had called him to be. Abigail's intervention is a beautiful example of how, through wisdom, humility, and respect, one person can help another avoid a costly mistake. She didn't resort to force or manipulation. She simply spoke truth into a moment of crisis. By reminding David of his higher calling and helping him see the bigger picture, Abigail played a pivotal role in keeping him on the path God had set before him. Her intervention was not just a momentary act of peace, it was a reminder that sometimes the right words at the right moment can change everything. Abigail's wisdom and restraint showed David the importance of patience, mercy, and faith in God's plan. She was a catalyst for David's growth as a leader, and her respect for him as the future king of Israel was the key to de-escalating the situation and preventing David from making a decision that would have affected his destiny. David's decision to listen to Abigail was a turning point in his journey. He had been ready to act in anger, but Abigail's wise and respectful approach redirected his path. In this moment, David's future as king became clearer. He was not just a warrior, he was a man of integrity, capable of mercy and restraint. And it was Abigail, with her wisdom and understanding, who helped him see that. Her intervention wasn't just about saving her household from David's wrath, it was about helping David stay true to his calling and making sure that he would one day lead Israel with the heart of a king after God's own heart. As we reflect on the life of David, we're reminded of the powerful lessons he teaches us: patience, respect, and wisdom. In the heat of conflict, David chose to wait on God's timing, trusting that God's plan would unfold in his perfect way. Even when faced with the opportunity to act on his anger, David demonstrated restraint, showing us that true strength is often found in self-control. He respected the position of authority, even in the most difficult circumstances, and chose mercy over vengeance. And through Abigail's wisdom, we see how a gentle approach and timely intervention can make all the difference in a moment of crisis. David's life calls us to pause, reflect, and ask ourselves, how can we apply these lessons in our own lives, whether it's trusting in God's timing, respecting those in authority, or acting with wisdom in moments of conflict. There's so much we can learn from the choices David made. If you found this story inspiring, take a moment to reflect on how you can live with patience, respect, and wisdom in your own journey. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories and lessons from the Bible. Thank you for watching, and may you be inspired to live out these timeless principles in your life.